Thank you so much, Charlie, and also thank you to All Souls Church for hosting us here as before for this lecture, the John Stott London Lecture. The sponsors, as you can see, are obviously All Souls, but Arusha and the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity and Langham. And there will be an opportunity in the middle of the evening to go and visit these stalls, to pick up literature, to buy some books over there, if you wish, from Langham, when we come to the refreshments time, and there will be some food and drink for us over there. So do check out these things before leaving. Just one other thing to say, of course, you have to say this, that if you need to go to the toilet, it is out those doors and down the stairs and then over on this side of the building if you need to. If you're watching us online, I'm sure you know where to go yourselves if you need to, and you're most welcome as well. Let me just very quickly, for those who haven't perhaps been to a John Stott London lecture before, explain what it is. If we can have the next slide that will come up. John Stott said these wonderful words, that we listen to the Word of God, with humble reverence, anxious to understand it and resolved to believe and obey what we come to understand. And we listen to the world with critical alertness, anxious to understand it too, and resolved not necessarily to believe and obey it, but to sympathize with it and to seek grace to discover how the gospel relates to it, i.e. to the world. So listening to the Word and the world, and John Stott called that double listening. And the London lectures have always sought to bring the scriptures and the world together in some way. And undoubtedly this evening, that is exactly what you will be hearing. Now, at this point, you need to get this next slide, because there's going to be question and answer. There will be Q&A, but it's not going to be from the floor or from online. Here's how you do it. There's a thing called Menti, and you need to go online and put in that www.menti.com and the entry code 8412473. And then that will take you through to the website where you can join the conversation, ask questions, make comments, and so on. Or you can do it directly with a QR code by putting your phone onto that. We leave that there for just a few more seconds so that you can do that. It will come back later on when we have our refreshments and break and Q&A. Then that slide will come up again, so you won't miss out if you haven't quite got the time to do it right now. Now, here are just a few questions to get us thinking about this issue before I invite Dr. Myrto to come and give us our lecture. Here's a question which is coming up on the screen. How many times do you think that the Bible calls for justice, especially for the poor? And if you have already got onto the menti.com, you could put in how many you think it might be. Is it under 100 times, somewhere up to 500 times, somewhere between 500 and 1,000, or between 1,000 and 2,000, or more than 2,000? How many times do you think the Bible speaks about justice for the poor? I'll give you a few seconds just to enter that, and then our clever people up at the desk will put up what you put in, so we can actually see what sort of answer we get over these next few seconds. Hands up who thinks it was under 500. Yep, few hands. How many think it's over 2,000? Quite a few more hands. You've got it. Actually, it is somewhere more than 2,000 times that the Bible speaks. The word poor comes somewhere about 200 times, but if you add in other words like justice, poverty, and so on, there's more than 2,000 references. Good. All right, let's move on to the next question, Dave, if we can do that on the screen. Let's see where we're coming up. This is a similar sort of a question, but it is more specific to this country. What percentage of children in the UK do you think are living in poverty? Is it under 10%, somewhere between 10 and 20, or between 20 and 30, or around 30? There's some answers going in, so it must be possible now for people to submit. That's good. All right. Thank you. So it looks like it's fairly evenly split between approximately 10 to 30 plus %. All right. Dave, do you want to reveal? The actual answer is, in fact, that it is 29% of children in this country living in poverty, which has just about doubled since 2017. And here, lastly, a question before we get into our lecture. Very quickly, what words or images do you associate with the word worship? What does worship make you think of? If you put in that word, we should get a bit of a word screen coming up. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. Excellent. Lots of stuff. What I'm not seeing in there anywhere is the word the poor. So, I think, having seen that and having thought that way through, let me now introduce our lecturer for this evening, Dr. Myrto Theocharous, who's here with her husband, Riyadh, sitting at the front, and you'll get a chance to meet them and talk to them over the refreshments. You can see what is coming on the screen already, that you've seen that and know it, that Myrto comes originally from Cyprus. She now is the professor of Old Testament studies at the Greek Bible College in Athens, which is actually where I first met Myrto a good number of years ago. She's a Langham Scholar. That means she's done her PhD through the Langham Partnership in Cambridge in Old Testament studies. She's written and published in the studies, and she's also involved hands-on with a ministry which she herself started and is the president of New Life, which is engaged rather like here with All Souls with Tamar, with street people, with women, with trafficked women, and all of that kind of thing there in Greece. So she speaks both with biblical expertise and with hands-on experience. So for our 2023 John Stott London Lecture, would you please welcome Dr. Myrto Theocharous. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Langham. Thank you, All Souls. Thank you all for coming. So, on October 7th, after a surprise attack, Hamas militants abducted more than 200 people to the Gaza Strip. The international community, shocked and worried for their well-being, was mobilized for their release. Every single person was fixed on their screens, listening to interviews of their relatives worried sick. Nobody knew what would happen to them. Will they make it? Will they be slaughtered by Hamas? Will they be killed by the bombings of their own people? How would you feel if an enemy attack happened here in England and militants took not 200 but 4 million people captives? What would your reaction be if 1 million of these were children who were kidnapped, chained in cold rooms with hardly any food given to them? Would there be anyone here who would say that this is not a criminal act? Who would not say that this is a state of emergency? Yet we do not say it. The lives and well-being of 4 million people today in the UK are under threat. 1 million children are stuck in freezing cold homes, sleeping on the floor with as little as 1 banana for their main meal. How is this not a hostage situation? Oh, come on, Myrto. These are not the same thing. How can you connect an enemy attack, something in the category of international war crimes, to living with the reality of poor individuals in our land? I understand the bewilderment, but I will not take credit for making this connection. The first individual to make this connection was Prophet Amos. He begins his prophecies by condemning the nations for international crimes, such as kidnapping entire populations and slaying open pregnant women, placing these war crimes on the same list with the crushing of the poor in Israel. And like Amos' audience, we are shocked at Hamas attacks, but we are not shocked at the state of the poor in our city. Nor are we shocked with the fact that this year, 350 individuals alone in the UK hold combined wealth of $796,459 billion, a sum larger than the annual GDP of Switzerland. 350 people. Of course, poverty is contextual, but it is straightforward and easily measurable. Globally, 700 million people live on less than $2.15 a day, which is the extreme poverty line set in 2022. But poverty carries with it much more than economic deprivation. One definition states, poverty is a shameful existence and one that is eventually capable of destroying a person's sense of self-worth and dignity, which should attend them as members of the human race. All these numbers we're hearing may be bewildering, so let me put a face to them. Let me introduce you to Joy, a victim of poverty and all that comes with it. Last Easter Sunday, one of our members of staff at our New Life anti-trafficking ministry said that she was bringing Joy to our house. Joy, not her real name, is a woman who has been trafficked from Eastern Europe, and after years of communication, prayers, and planning, she was rescued and finally freed. Away from her family now, rejected and stigmatized after her trafficker shamed her to her relatives. Alone, without a job, knowledge of the local language, and the ability to navigate in the country. But Joy was happy. She was freed. God's liberating hand was upon her. We were so excited this Easter would be so different from previous ones. Jesus found us worthy enough to come to our home. So the doorbell rang, and I ran to the door. A thin, small, dark-haired young woman stood shyly at the entrance, not feeling herself worthy to enter. She kept thanking me for allowing her to come to my house. I embraced her, looked into her eyes, and thought, if only you knew, I am the one not worthy to receive you. I'm the one full of gratitude that you would pick our home on Resurrection Sunday. Christ is risen, we said to each other, and I had no doubt that it was true. He was standing risen right in front of me, more alive than ever, risen after having carried the sins of the world on his body. And now I was given the chance to be part of this resurrection story as well. You will find various definitions of poverty, but they're all incomplete. The missing element is that the poor are sacred, and they are an indispensable part of our worship. I will invite you to see with me how the author of the book of Deuteronomy builds this argument in the book and how it is biblically justified to see our Lord Jesus Christ visiting our home when Joy visits us. In general, in ancient Near Eastern societies, it was the responsibility of the father, the oldest male alive in the family, to care for the members of his household. Within a household, when a husband died, leaving behind a widow and orphans, then another male family member was expected to step in and care for those left behind. The two dominant values behind this duty were honor and fear of shame. Since the chief role of the dominant males of the community was to be protectors of the community, failure to make provisions for those in need was deemed a shameful act. Also, the reverse, demonstrating in public such care for the vulnerable would bring one honor and prestige. In patriarchal societies, the ultimate patriarch is the king, the father of the country. Therefore, as the ultimate patriarch, it is expected of the monarch that he should show concern for those in need of his protection. Indeed, the categories of widow and orphan, together with the poor, generally appear to have become a mark of honorable concern, a kind of distinctive mark for the dominant male in his role as protector. So a just king, a righteous king, therefore, is one who cares for the widow and the orphan. Even though the widow and the orphan had become a stock phrase, it nevertheless refers to miserable realities. Ancient texts show us that contrasts between the rich and the poor were very real, given that these categories are widespread throughout ancient literature. And in Israel, these class differentiations became increasingly more pronounced with the introduction of the monarchy. Texts also inform us of the dangers of the abuse of the vulnerable and actual tensions that would warrant repetitive mentions concerning the care of the poor, the orphan, and the widow. Moreover, from this text, it is clear that these groups had expectations from the patron of their community for their protection. As expected, whenever the care for the widow and the orphan is mentioned, it is almost always found on the lips of royal propaganda that had the purpose of showing how just the particular king was. He would present himself as having fulfilled his duty as the ultimate patriarch by satisfying the divine will for a just society, thereby showing that the gods were right to select him. Conversely, if a king would fail in this area, then he was considered inadequate for the throne. We have a prime example from Mesopotamia. It's the self-description of King Hammurabi in the prologue of his law collection as the one whom the gods had chosen because he will bring justice in his land, he will terminate evil and stop the powerful from oppressing the weak. In the epilogue of his law code, he closes with the assurance that in order that the powerful would not wrong the weak, in order to give justice to the orphan and the widow, I wrote down my priceless instruction on this stealing. So based on this statement, he then proceeds to request the favor of the gods. Also, King Ur-Nama in Mesopotamia also declares, I did not hand over the orphan to the rich. I did not leave the widow into the hands of the powerful. These texts and many others show clearly that the protection of the vulnerable groups was considered to be the divine will, and the expectation was that any king who was considered just would promote these principles. At the same time, we observe that the laws in the ancient Near East that actually secure the rights of the widow and the orphan are very limited. The actual code of Ur-Nama, in spite of the claims of the preamble, lacks any laws dealing explicitly with the poor, the widows, or the orphans. This tends to be the pattern throughout the ancient Near East, with a brief mention of the poor within the prologue, but largely absent within the actual legislation. Also, the emphasis in these texts refer to the legal rights in court of the vulnerable groups, rather than prescribing any charitable help to them. So while the king presents himself as the protector of the orphan and the widow against anyone who attempts to wrong them, nowhere does he seem to offer goods, benefiting them in any material way or caring about their physical survival. So this royal prologue and epilogue seem to have served propagandistic purposes rather than offer an accurate picture of actual measures taken for the sake of widows and orphans. The poor were thus instrumentalized for the sake of showing one's benevolence, generosity, charity, godliness, and above all, irreplaceability for the well-being of the kingdom. I often follow the news the successes of the anti-trafficking police, for example, that manages to capture traffickers and free a large number of women from their control. But I often wonder what happens beyond this publicity, and how have these victims been taken care of and assisted to stand on their own 2 feet again? Unfortunately, we often find these women ending back to the brothels for sustained care and protection for them is lacking. So these publicities earn points to each government in power, but nothing substantial exists behind the headlines. Now, a declaration of having taken care of the poor is also present as an epilogue after the law in the book of Deuteronomy. Only this declaration is part of Israelite worship. Deuteronomy is the place where we find for the first time the command to recite liturgies, specific declarations or specific prayers that accompany certain actions the Israelite is instructed to do. I am particularly interested in the instructions that are placed at the end of the legal portion of the book, the climax of the liturgy, as I like to think of it. After all the actions expected of a God-pleasing life have been laid out. So after the Israelite presents the first fruits at the sanctuary and says the accompanying liturgical words, then the presentation of the tithes follow. In this epilogue, every Israelite, and not just the king, is obligated to stand before God's presence and make a declaration of obedience. So the text says, when you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the 3rd year, which is the year of the tithe, giving it to the Levites, the aliens, the orphans, and the widows, so that they may eat their fill within your towns, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion from the house, and I have given it to the Levites, the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows, in accordance with your entire commandment that you commanded me. I have neither transgressed nor forgotten any of your commandments. I have not eaten of it while in mourning. I have not removed any of it while I was unclean, and I have not offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God, doing just as you commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation from heaven and bless your people Israel and the ground that you have given us, as you swore to our ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. So this epilogue has some important characteristics worth noting. First, it presents the Israelite making a declaration for the care of the vulnerable groups, which, as we have seen already, was a declaration exclusive to kings in the ancient Near East. What ends up happening in Deuteronomy is a democratization of the royal responsibility. So the care of the poor is no longer a moral responsibility for the king exclusively, but for every Israelite landowner in Israel. This democratization makes the care of the poor a requirement that's independent of each individual government and binds every individual, including those in authority. It does not remove the obligation of caring for the poor from the king, from the state, but it broadens it to all the people. And it is this idea of broadening the responsibility to all that justifies then the prophets of Israel to condemn all the people, to address all the people for the state of the poor in Israel, and not just the king, which was common in ancient Near East. Second, the declaration does not serve to justify the choice of a particular king as the ideal divine representative, but it becomes part of Israelite worship. In Deuteronomy, the declaration, I cared for the poor, is not just an epilogue, but it is the final and necessary step in the process of caring for the poor in the broader life of worship. The text describes a liturgical ceremony where each Israelite must appear before God to give an account, to testify, rather, that he has fulfilled his work completely. Now, the prayer is ready-made. It is not a confession, since no failure is mentioned, nor an absolution is given by the priest. Rather, it is a profession of loyalty to Yahweh and his Torah. his law. The Israelite does not choose the way in which he will present himself before God and what form his piety would take. The kind of worshiper that God requires is predetermined. And the prayer does not permit any kind of piety that has excluded the poor of the land. That would be pagan worship. We will see that later. In other words, if you're not in the position to say this prayer before God as it is, then there is no alternative prayer for you. This is it. What does this prayer do? In a bidirectional way, this worship ceremony brings your daily life into the liturgy in the presence of God, and likewise makes your daily life part of the liturgy before the presence of God. Any separation is eliminated this way. In fact, only now can the Israelite ask for God's blessing. Remember, in Hammurabi's law code, the great achievement for the king was to write just laws. And based on that writing, he is asking for divine favor. But in Deuteronomy 26, we see that God's favor, his blessing on the land and its fruit, may be asked for only after the law of social care has been fully implemented and then brought before God as a verbal offering. Therefore, the only ground on which one may ask for God's blessing is the act of distributing the yield of the land to the poor. Generally, in Deuteronomy, the promise for the blessing of the fertility of the land and the labor of the Israelite always accompanies economic giving to the poor. This is very interesting to me because I grew up hearing this well-meaning phrase, "Let me bless you with some money. Let us bless the poor with our collection." But here I see that the people never bless the poor. In fact, we see the poor blessing the people when given back their outer garments at night. The text says, "Then they will bless you, and it will be regarded as righteousness for you before the Lord your God." 24:13. It's the poor who bless. Third, this declaration refers to an existing law in Deuteronomy. It is not simply a generalized statement about fulfilling one's duties. The common slogan, "I care for the poor," that we saw instrumentalized in royal propaganda. The law to which it refers is the 3-year tithe that was already established in chapter 14. And this law is about active social care. It's a care fund in Israel. Let us see now what this liturgical climax presupposes. The practice of tithing one's produce was a well-known phenomenon in antiquity, but it was commonly used to preserve temples and their staff, or as a royal tax for the sustenance of the ruling class. These were, in fact, royal temples, so the offerings given there belonged to the king. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, however, the practice is unique and unprecedented. It stands against taxation that supports the royal ideology. The primary goal of the tithes is not the preservation of the temple, but they are to be consumed by their own owners in the central sanctuary, in the presence of Yahweh, together with the Levites. However, the real innovation of Deuteronomy concerns the supplementary instructions about the tithes of the 3rd year, to which chapter 26 was referring to, and that is found nowhere else in the Bible or outside the Bible. The instructions in Deuteronomy 14:28-29, they go like this: "Every 3rd year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year and store it within your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans and the widows in your towns, may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you undertake. In other words, every third year, the Israelites are not to take the tithe of their produce to the sanctuary for their own consumption there or for the sanctuary's function, but they are to keep it in their towns where it is collected in special storage places for grain, wine, and oil, and it will remain there available for distribution to vulnerable groups. So from this third-year tithe, one is not permitted to eat nor use for other purposes. It belongs in its entirety to the poor of the land. How is this tithe of social care called? I apologize for the very small letters, but this tithe is called HaKodesh, the sacred, as we see in 26:13, referring to it. Now, the root Kadash in biblical and extra-biblical sources may have the meaning of cleansing, purifying, sanctifying, something holy. The objects that go through these acts are almost without exception connected to religious and cultic contexts and are in a more intimate relationship with the deity. The abstract noun Kodesh, holiness, when it appears as a noun by itself in the Pentateuch and not as an adjective, it is a concrete designation for the sanctuary, the temple, the holy place. But it also refers to items of food that are designated for the sanctuary, for the priests there, for the Levites there. In Deuteronomy also, the sacred, HaKodesh, refers once to all the offerings the Israelites were instructed to carry to the tabernacle. But in 26:13, the sacred is no longer what is exclusively destined for the temple and those who serve it. Now, the sacred, HaKodesh, is the third-year tithe, food that is not destined for the sanctuary, food that is destined for the poor. In other words, HaKodesh, what used to designate only the food destined for and consumed at the sanctuary, now designates food destined and consumed by the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow in their towns, as if the poor were branches of the sanctuary away from the sanctuary. Because these tithes now are not transferred to the Holy Temple, but they remain in the towns in order to be given to common hands, it is possible that the Israelites would misunderstand them to be common or profane, not really sacred. However, the text supports that just because the tithe remains in the towns, it does not mean that it is secularized. Instead, this tithe appears to be already sanctified, meaning that it is ceremonially separated, even though it remains in the vicinity of Israelite homes in each village. In other words, it does not belong to the owner, and it must be delivered to its rightful owner, who is the poor of the community. Withholding these goods would be equivalent to theft or violation. Their owner, even though he does not move them to the temple, he's obliged to give an account that he got rid of them from his house and made them available to the poor. And this is the same verb, up in the corner, you can see the same verb that is used when the Israelite has to drive out the evil from his community, the verb bier. It's very urgent that he gets rid of them. So what we see here then is the possibility of a cultic offering outside the temple. The object is considered sacred because it is claimed by God himself. Only in this specific case, God is surrendering his rights and hands his tithes to the poor wherever they are found. That means that God identifies with the most vulnerable groups of the land, even with the foreigner. Now, the sanctity of the third-year tithe is evident also in the way that it could be profaned. The Israelite in his prayer had to confess that he had not eaten from it during his mourning or touched it, possibly because in cases of death, the Israelite was unclean from contact with the corpse during burial. What is clear in this text is that there is a concern for the ritual cleanness of the tithe offering. But this would normally make sense to us if the offering was headed to the sanctuary, destined for Yahweh himself and not for the poor of the land. But here, the offering of unclean food to the poor was not allowed either. The fact that there was a concern not to defile something holy suggests that it was regarded as a sacrifice. But a sacrifice away from the temple? Now, if you know Deuteronomy, you know this is a big problem. A big problem in Deuteronomy was the existence of sacred places on mountains, hills, and under every leafy tree. The Israelites were tempted to offer sacrifices in these places where idols or sacred pillars stood in order to secure fertility for their land. However, Deuteronomy forbids such sacred places and sacrifices offered anywhere apart from the central sanctuary that Yahweh would designate. The triennial sacred tithes to the poor, in a sense, replace these sacred high places. And the fertility of the land is now connected exclusively to the care of the vulnerable groups, as the prayer of the Israelites shows in chapter 26. Now, this is a radical dismantling of the idolatrous worship in fertility cults. The Israelite no longer secures the fertility of the land by feeding gods, but by feeding the poor. We often think that idolatry is a big problem only because it threatens the exclusive worship of Yahweh. But idolatry was equally a problem because it stole from the offerings that were supposed to sustain the poor of the land, and made worship and prayers for success and prosperity independent of the care of the poor. This is pagan worship. Now, at this point, we may be convinced that the Bible encourages us to care for the poor and that there is a sacred dimension to this. But to be honest, it is so much easier for us to give materially to the poor than be engaged with them. Many think that constantly giving to the poor does not always help their situation in life and may maintain the gap between them and us. What if the scriptures went beyond material giving? What if they encouraged us to be a poor church in solidarity with them, to share their burden? To understand this difficult aspect, we must look a bit deeper into the identity of the Levites. As we saw already, Deuteronomy 14 is a unique institution of social care in Israel, but it is also an institution that links the poor to the Levites, in particular, extending the sanctity of the Levite to the destitute of the land. Scholars were largely concerned with Levitical identity and the historical provenance of the book in Levitical circles, and for this reason, they tended to study the priests and the Levites in isolation, without seeing the intentional link that Deuteronomy creates between the Levites and the vulnerable groups. How is this link between the two categories achieved? Well, the main feature concerning the Levites that is emphasized in the book of Deuteronomy is the state of their landlessness. Already in the book of Numbers, Aaron was told that there would be no inheritance for him and the Levites in the land of Israel. He was told that Yahweh himself would be his inheritance. Therefore, what is most holy to God is also landless. Something very peculiar, since God's ultimate gift to his people is land inheritance, the holiest persons in Israel must paradoxically resemble the most vulnerable people in Israel, those who have nowhere to lay their heads. You may start making some connections now. In Deuteronomy, we already have landless groups whose landlessness arises from factors very dissimilar to the situation of the Levites, of course. The widow and the orphan are groups that would easily lose any claim to their land without the protection of an adult male or male defender in court. The alien as well has no inheritance in Israel and no protective ties of kinship. So these groups would be more readily neglected than the Levite, since no sacred status is enjoyed by them. Now, God is the inheritance of the Levites, and this meant that the Levites should be dependent on God, but not in an abstract way. It meant that God would be the one to decide how they would be sustained, and his decision was through the tithes of the people. Deuteronomy repeats the command, do not neglect, do not forget the Levite, and this parallels the command, do not forget Yahweh. So clearly God is identified with his Levites and asks that people treat them as they would treat him. He had already instructed the Israelites not to leave the Levites homeless, but to offer 6 cities of refuge to them where they could live with their families, and 42 other towns in addition, together with their surrounding pasture lands. Their houses were also protected under the Jubilee law. But the Levites apparently were so dependent on others that Scripture saw it fit to include them with the categories of the underprivileged. Now, the Levites are holy people of honor, permitted to be in the closest proximity to Yahweh and his sanctuary, and they're in charge of God's holy things. Nothing in the alien, the widow, and the orphan appears to be sacred. Therefore, nothing places a demand on Israel to treat them as holy, unless the holiest people of Israel blend in with them, unless they become one group, unless they tend to appear together as one, unless God allots his sacred food, part of his kadosh, tithe, to them as well. So imagine we get accustomed to hearing, bring food to your pastor, the refugee, and the single mom. Bring a drink to your pastor, the refugee, and the single mom. Buy a Christmas gift to your pastor, the refugee, and the single mom. Or you cannot use this money because it is reserved for your pastor, the refugee, and the single mom. What if you keep hearing this over and over so that these 3 categories become one, and you are no longer able to think of them separately or to hierarchize your treatment towards them? And these groups do not appear holy now because they begin to resemble the Levite more, but because the Levite, by means of his landlessness and dependence on Yahweh for his sustenance, resembles them more. The landless groups become the model after which the Levites are called to live. Now, with the example I used, I do not want you to think that this call is for the pastor or for a few missionaries. Israel, who are as a whole supposed to be a royal priesthood, is given the Levites as a model that calls them to adjust their values and surrender their entitlements. The Levites were not there to be strictly differentiated from the people as totally other, but they are there to function as role models for what every Israelite should aspire to be. One Old Testament scholar says that the relation of Levite to Israel in Deuteronomy is such as to be an ideal representation of how the whole people should stand both to Yahweh and to the land. So God, through the election of the Levites, makes some crucial theological points for all God's people. They are to realize that since the most sacred group in Israel, the priests and Levites, have no inheritance in the land, perhaps possession of the land is relativized. And the presence of God may be a higher privilege than land titles and material possessions. Second, they are to see not only that the Levites are identified with God and are therefore sacred, but the poor are identified with God and are also, in some sense, sacred, given that the Kadosh offering of the triennial tithes is dedicated to them away from the sanctuary. Third, while the Israelites rightly give from their possessions and the yield of their land, they hold banquets and feasts and invite the needy to eat alongside them, they should also look at how the Levites, their ideal exemplars, relate to the poor. The Levites do not merely give food to the landless, but they relate to them differently. They are called to be in solidarity with them, eating from the same holy offerings, demonstrating dependence on Yahweh, and sharing in the same uncertainties of where food may be coming from and whether other Israelites will remember them, as the Lord had instructed them to do. Fourth, now we must be careful with this. I'm not saying that the state of the poor is a romantic and an attractive state to be in. It is a horrific state. And the Levites are not called to embrace the horrific state for its own sake. Actually, the Levites' poverty is not an ideal. A poor Levite, a hungry Levite, would be a sign of the people's disobedience, their godless independence, their individualistic oblivion to the life of the body politic. Indeed, the point of the Levites' landlessness is that they are landless for the sake of all of Israel's religious life, and therefore they have a right to eat from the best of the land. But this right and this ideal is never to be thought of in isolation from the destitute of the land, since Deuteronomy goes into great pains to keep the Levites and the poor constantly connected. The prosperity of the Levite is dependent on the daily obedience of the Israelite, and so is the prosperity of the poor. Now, we have seen how care for the poor was primarily the king's duty in the ancient Near East. We have seen how Deuteronomy applies this responsibility to every Israelite, making it an indispensable part of their worship, and reveals the sacred status of the poor. Finally, we have seen how God presents his ideals through the election of the Levites. They are called to resemble the poor in their landlessness and dependence on Yahweh, who feeds them both. And what does all this have to do with us today? Well, first, we must admire how Jesus, our great high priest, comes to fulfill the ideals of Israel. Being rich and equal to the Father, he becomes poor in the form of a slave. He lives the life of the Son of Man who has nowhere to lay his head. And he survives dependent on his Father and his community that takes care of him and follows him. We usually end our sermons with Jesus, but I often get the sense that at the end we all feel relieved that Jesus did all that, so I don't have to do anything. No, Jesus did all that to enable us to do likewise, to place us on the same path he walked, the path of solidarity with the poor. He could have brought the poor up, and at times he did, but his work on earth was primarily to take a step down, to lessen the gap. Finally, I want to end with joy, because I know that most of us fear this message. We want comfort. We are scared of misery. Where is joy to be found? In fact, joy is a major theme in Deuteronomy. The liberator God did not free his people from Egypt to abandon them in misery. He knows where joy is to be found, and joy in Deuteronomy is always around a table. This table is in the presence of God, in his sanctuary, remembering God's salvation and celebrating the gift of the land. In Deuteronomy 16 and elsewhere, the Israelite comes to the sanctuary, he takes his household there and eats from God's blessings, and his household is made up of 4 groups: his sons, daughters, male servants, and female servants. But in the same verses, God brings his own household to share in this joy. Those who cannot find a protective roof anywhere else, at the table. 4 groups again to match the household of the Israelites: the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. In other words, God is saying, I take care of your household, and please take care of mine. And there you will find joy. Trust me, there you will find joy. Thank you.
So, Myrto, the question is, could you please tell some stories of what this looks like in terms of your own ministry among refugees and trafficked people? You did tell us a bit about joy in your lecture, yes. But can you tell us something more, because it's obviously fascinating what you do?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. There's many stories, but there's one that kind of highlights this idea of being on the same level with the poor, let's say, and even them being higher than us and ministering to us. And one example I have of that is one of the women who was working in prostitution. And we were, I had to travel for my studies, and we kept writing to each other. And in one of her letters, she put a ring inside the envelope as a gift to me. And I thought, okay, it cannot be valuable. I mean, it's a fake ring probably. But then when I went back home, I saw it again, and there were some numbers inside, and I checked, and it was a real golden ring. Wow. She sent me probably her only most precious thing she had, and she sent it to me. So this was so moving to me, and it was a message to me of what we were speaking earlier, of how the poor are blessing us. They are a blessing to us, and we should really start thinking of them as higher than we are, thinking of them more highly than ourselves, and what we can learn from them, because they have so much to give. Maybe not gold, but the most precious things they have, this is what they bring, and this is all they have. And it reminds me also of the poor widow giving her contribution, her tithe. And really, it's so much more valuable when you receive from people who really don't have much, but they give you the most precious thing they have. And that's much more than I could give to them. So I guess that's one of the stories. I carry this ring always with me, and it reminds me of how precious they are.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I was very impressed with the way you did turn that around, that we talk about blessing the poor when it's they who bless us, and also that the prayer in Deuteronomy 26, which is a wonderful chapter, I love it, the prayer is that you can only pray for God to bless his land and us when you have obeyed his law.
Yes.
But what's also interesting in that same chapter is that the first part of the chapter, which obviously for reasons of space you couldn't put all on the screen, celebrates that it is God's gift of grace that I have come to this land that you have given me.
Exactly.
So, in other words, it's not God, here, I've done all the things you've asked, now you must bless me. It's not that kind of,
Yes.
obey and therefore get blessing. It's God blesses first, then we respond, and then we can say, now, Lord, please continue the blessing. So it's just kind of a cycle, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, precisely. The land is a gift. It is not owned by the people, and they realize that it is God's land, and they demonstrate this with their gift. And also, it's the land of the Levites. And they are not claiming it, but it actually belongs to them. You are able to have more and eat more because we surrendered our rights to it. So, and we should think of the poor in the same way, because God has put them together with the Levites. We should start thinking of them this way, that what I have earned is what they have surrendered. Yes. Maybe not voluntarily, but it's their blessings too. So, yeah.
It is sort of scandalous, isn't it, that the church through the ages, the Christian church through the ages, has completely neglected that aspect of what God said to the Old Testament religious establishment, one might call it, the priesthood and the Levites, were precisely to not accumulate land and wealth and property and everything else, and yet that's the way the church has often gone, as if... Yes. So really picking up what we just said, have you any explanation as to why it is that the link between the Levites and the poor, which, as you say, is so strong in those texts in the Old Testament, why that's been lost in most modern Christian teaching, or just not even noticed?
Yes, this is a very good question. It's not lost everywhere, because there are some traditions that elevate the poverty of the church much more than maybe our Western traditions. So I had the blessing of getting to know the Coptic church the last few years.
You've married into the Coptic church. Yeah, Myrto's husband, Riyadh, who's here with us, is from Egypt. And Coptic basically means Egyptian, so a Coptic Christian leader also studying for his doctorate, so carry on.
So if we should really listen to other traditions and the church around the majority world, because not all of them function the same way. For some people, poverty is a very high value, and hospitality to the poor, sacrificial even hospitality to the poor is a very, very high value. I will not forget one monastery we visited in Egypt, where we climbed up on the stairs, and there was a hole in the wall, and I asked, what is this hole here? And they answered that when people were attacking the monastery, trying to kill the monks were throwing food from their supplies to the enemy, because for them it was more important to fulfill the duty of hospitality to these people than survive their death. So it sounds so extreme to us, because we have lost really some of these values, and we should start listening to the global church and bring them back.
That's a fascinating example. I remember John Stott used to say, when people challenged the issue of being interested in issues like social justice and care for the poor and so on, he'd say, well, Paul tells us what to do. He says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him.
Yes. Some people take it literally.
Yes, they take it literally, yes, which is wonderful. And one wonders what difference would it have made if, for example, after 9/11, instead of bombing Afghanistan, we had dropped food baskets on the country. But that's what your monks were doing. It's very, very interesting. But of course, that element was there in the Western Church pre-modern, in the monastic movement, wasn't it? Of one of the traditions had those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience.
Yes.
So they deliberately made themselves dependent on the generosity of other believers in order to pray and to work and so on. Yeah. So it was part of the tradition.
This was there, and if we read the early church fathers, we will see how much charity, hospitality, the care of the poor, and what I said today is not new. Some fathers connected even the presence of Christ in the Eucharist with the poor outside in the street, and they said it's the same presence is here and it's also there. Yeah. They connected the two together, so it has been carried in some cases, but yeah, we don't read that much about it anymore, sadly.
Yeah. And then coming back to Deuteronomy, it's fascinating that in Deuteronomy 10, I mean, you know Deuteronomy inside out. You're writing a commentary on it.
Still learning.
Yes, but you're writing a commentary on it at the moment. But in Deuteronomy 10, Moses talks about Yahweh God. He's the God of gods, Lord of lords, King of kings, the whole universe. Everything belongs to him. But where will you find him? And immediately it says that he is the God, that you can't corrupt because he doesn't accept bribes. He cares for the poor, the foreigner, the Levite, the widow, and therefore you are to do that. So in that sense, where you will find God is where you go to those people. I mean, this is the God who runs the universe, but you don't find them in the palaces of the kings. You'll find him at the bottom of the heap.
Yes.
Very interesting there in Deuteronomy 10.
Yes,
Sorry.
yes.
Yes.
It's amazing that if you start getting this lens, you will see it in more places than you would pass over it normally. I was reading Malachi recently, and I saw that he's picking up on this with the tithes, and he's saying, "You have robbed me. How have we robbed you? You didn't bring your tithes." But it's not just the temple tithe. In the previous verses, he's speaking about the poor and the orphans and the widows. So the connection is already there. You have robbed me because you didn't bring the tithes that will feed them.
Yeah.
So it's very, very interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
So not caring for the poor is actually robbing God.
Yes.
Which is very, very challenging,
Exactly.
isn't it? Yeah. Here's another question we got. Tough one, but how can the church address the fact that it has benefited from the poor through colonialism in the past and global capital in the present that perpetuates poverty globally? So the church benefits from the poor.
Yes.
A response to that at all?
Yes, well, the acknowledgement of this truth is the first and huge step that the church really needs to come to terms with. So this is a huge step. And then, yes, repentance for what we have done, what we have, how we have wronged God, how we have wronged His body. Yeah, I mean, there's always chance to make things right.
How do you think we can make things right?
Yes, I was hoping this talk would inspire people to brainstorm themselves how you can each do something in your own context, and we can all find where we placed a gap or a border between us and the poor. Am I living in an area that is very far removed from people? Do I avoid certain streets? Do I choose a church that is very clean and tidy and all in the same class? There's ways to bridge that gap, to lessen that gap, and this is a challenge for all of us in our context. So each one can recognize how to get closer. So I don't want to preach about doing, you have to do more. No, it's about being in the company, being in the presence of these people. So don't avoid them. That's where joy is found, being in the presence of them, and then living with them and crying with them. So, it's not about how can I become a better savior for them. I'm not their savior, and this history has taught us that we are not the saviors, and when we attempt to be, we actually achieve the opposite. So we must recognize that, no, I need to be saved like rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is going to save me.
Yes. Wow, yes.
Yeah.
And the end of that story of the rich man and Lazarus, the sting in the tail, is when Jesus says to the rich man, or Abraham says to the rich man, they have the law and the prophets. In other words, they have the scriptures. He should have known what to do if he'd only read Deuteronomy.
But we don't read it.
That's right. They have the law and the prophets. And so if they don't listen to the scriptures, they won't listen even if someone rises from the dead. So even if you claim, as it were, to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, if you don't read these scriptures which tell us that, then, we haven't got on the first rung, really.
It's amazing that that is the test of believing in the resurrection.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Here we go. We're still moving on. Going back to your chapter 26 of Deuteronomy and chapter 14, which is the triennial tithe. And like you, I have always found it fascinating that chapter 26 comes after 12 to 26. How many is 12 to 26? 13 or 14 chapters of multiple laws. There's loads of laws in there that could have been quoted. But the one that chapter 26 specifically refers to is the triennial tithe for the poor. And says, in a sense, is saying, if you haven't kept that one, then you can't claim to have obeyed God's law. So the law has not been kept if the poor are not being cared for. So it's a very powerful thing. But what the questioner asks here is, can you suggest what might be the equivalent today of that triennial tithe? Where would you draw some sort of a parallel between what the triennial tithe was obviously a systemic kind of response. It was basically 10% every third year of GDP. That's 3% a year. It's almost like a social tax to create a social fund for the poor. Is there anything comparable to that either in the secular world today or in state legislation or in the church? Where do you see that kind of comparison? And the other part of the question was, you spoke about, quote, the poor church. So what does that look like today?
Wow, tough questions.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, this system of social care that is conceived for the first time in Deuteronomy, it's something that has influenced various nations and various societies for a social care system. But we must see whether countries are trying to avoid it or get around it or how they want to diminish it. So it is a blessing that many countries have adopted it, and I hope we continue and we let it grow. But things are more complex, and that's not an excuse to do less, but it's an excuse to get to know the poor and their needs better, so that our systems that are put in place are serving them better. There are enough people, enough agencies that are doing that, and hopefully we can assist them. In the church, yes, many churches are doing that, and but again, my problem is not simply, okay, let's bring more money. My problem that I see in various churches is the blending together, the sitting in one table, this kind of equalization. That is, it's their church. It's not the church serving the poor out there. It's the poor are the church, and they are here. They're serving us. We are not the ones showing hospitality. They accept us in their midst. So we need to start reversing our conversation in this way. So. I remember a friend, she's from Iran, a convert from Iran, and people were asking her, how can the church in England be more welcoming to you? And she said, to stop being welcoming. Because you're always welcoming me. I've been here for so many years, and I'm not part of the church, of the leadership, of the decision making. I'm always being welcomed. So stop welcoming me. So this is the answer. The poor are the church, and we should be served by them. Let them serve us. Allow them to serve us.
Yeah. That reversal of perception of host and guest, I think, is very interesting. I remember, I mean, you know the whole world of theological education. This is me sort of going sideways a bit. But one of the reasons why John Stott founded the Langham Partnership was his concern that many seminaries in the non-Western world, the majority world, are lacking in resources. They're poor, financially, materially poor. And so often the Western churches and seminaries want, as it were, generously want to say, what can we do to help? How can we welcome you? But it's always in the position of being the host, as it were. Please come to our table. You know, you're most welcome at our table. And I remember challenging people to say, when will we get to the place where it's they who become the host and we are the guests, and they set the table and they decide the menu, and they provide the food, and it's something of learning, as Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive, but sometimes it's harder to receive than to give.
Yes, exactly.
And we need sometimes to learn that. And I think what you're saying is that we need to see the poor as givers to the church. As Paul says of the Macedonian church, that out of their poverty they gave.
Yes.
Out of extreme poverty, he said, actually, they gave.
And it's about giving what is most precious to us. And it's most precious to us, our ego sometimes, our sense of worth, a sense of usefulness. We should offer this over, hand it over. And so what would we do with that? We want to be the host. We don't want to give that up. No. If that's what God is calling us to give up, then we should. So, I think it's up to us to reflect what
and that can sometimes be actually literal host. I mean, at a meal. I mean, I remember being challenged over this in visiting folks in poorer countries. Particularly, I was in Myanmar once, and to go to the home of someone who invites you to their home to have a meal which you know they would have all sorts of meats and chicken and everything else, which will probably have cost them at least a month's salary to just provide a meal for you. And yet, to them, that is honoring them, that you have chosen to be a guest in their home. And so often it seems that we feel we should welcome the poor to our table. But actually it can be more honoring to go as a guest to there and let them be the host. And I think this is on a more, that's on a personal scale, but on a more ecclesial scale, that can also be true.
Yes, exactly.
Oops, my phone's gone dead. I need to just pull this back up again and find my next question. Unless you've got something else you wanted to add there at that point.
No, go on.
Okay. Now, this may test your knowledge of the UK, but the church through various agencies, this is the church in the UK, through various agencies, for example, there's an organisation called Christians Against Poverty, CAP, which does a huge amount on debt counselling and helping people out of debt, a very respectable and well-known charity. And food banks, of course, of which there are now more food banks than McDonald's in this country. To name just two, already do try to draw alongside the poor. Would you consider these examples of the church to be, in some sense, modern 21st century UK examples of the Levite model?
Yes, well, I am not aware of them very much on how they work, but if this is their life choice and to be closer to the poor and not doing it from a superiority position, but try to be friends with them, have a friendship, and have direct the policies and the procedures and all of that according to what the poor think they want and what they need, then this is valuable. But of course, each organization, you have to. It's on a journey of learning, and you have to let the poor speak, let the people who you are serving speak up and become part of the organization, become part of your decision making and all of this. So bring them up to a level where you can cooperate. So this is, for me, this is the key. So the Levite is someone who is, always lumped together with these people. So even though they have different roles, they have certain prayers to do, certain teaching and all of that, but they are, even the king goes under the Levites, as you know, in Deuteronomy, and he has to be taught by them. He has to sit down and write the law. So if the king has to sit under the Levites, who are in this poor condition, then how much more we? So perhaps they are. I don't know.
It's fascinating because the Levites, of course, were the theological educators of Israel. It was their responsibility to teach God's law to his people. That was as well the priests. In fact, the priests, as well as bringing the sacrifices, were the ones who were the guardians of the law and to teach the people these things. And yet they themselves were dependent on the people, which may be where Paul particularly gets that idea that those who teach the word and are serving the church in that way. It is the church's responsibility to make sure that they are cared for and paid and fed and so on.
Yes.
And he makes a wonderful, this is Deuteronomy again, Paul makes a wonderful example of a text which we might otherwise completely dismiss as irrelevant in an urban setting when you remember in 1 Corinthians 9, he's talking about the responsibility of churches to care for evangelists and pastors and preachers. And he says, doesn't the law also tell us that? And then he quotes from Deuteronomy, do not muzzle the ox when it's treading out the grain. In other words, a working animal deserves to be fed from the produce of its own work. So don't muzzle it, let it eat. And he says, does God only care about oxen? Is this not also written for us? Yeah. So if God cares to feed oxen, how much more to feed pastors and so on?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Here's a question, and this does get thrown up, and indeed I heard this only recently from someone who meant it seriously, as a reason for somehow just accepting the fact that poverty is there. Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. That's there, it's true. So what do you make of that saying of Jesus in the context of what you've just been saying? And how do we dismantle this us-them mentality, us and them as the poor, in a largely privileged church? How do we grow authentic proximity to the poor? But perhaps first tackle, what do you say when people say to you, but Jesus said, the poor you'll always have with you?
Of course, he's quoting Deuteronomy, as you know.
He is, indeed. He is.
And Deuteronomy wouldn't intend, you will always have the poor with you, so don't worry about them. They're always going to be there. No, just read the rest of the verse. You will always have the poor with you, therefore open your hands to them and give them,
Deuteronomy 15.
So,
if you want to check Deuteronomy 15, okay? Yeah.
So it's incredible, but also we should not forget that Jesus is the poor, and he's being ministered and fed and welcomed by others. So he's one of the poor. He's not distancing himself from them, saying, you will always have the poor, but me is not in a different category. And actually what is happening there in the New Testament, of course there's a million interpretations, but what is happening, the way I see it, is that this woman is offering, is showing so much love and appreciation to Jesus in that moment, and it makes me wonder, what is the ultimate offering you could give to the poor? It's to give them a burial, a very luxurious burial, because then there's no chance you will be getting anything back from them. They're dead. Yes. So, and this is what he's using as an example. Yes. He's anointing my body for burial. And it's also a message about waste, which is brilliant, because to be a person who accumulates wealth is the same in some sense with thriftiness. I recently read an article on Christianity Today on thriftiness, and it's the flip side of it. Because you give money the same power. So I have to be very careful with the money. But actually, spending it without thinking on the poor, even carelessly, it shows your absolute freedom from the power of wealth. That's the stance that this woman is showing. Doesn't care. She doesn't calculate. Do not calculate when you are before someone. Just give your most precious things to them, and God will take care of what will happen tomorrow. So it's a really amazing story.
It is an amazing story. And thank you for making the point that Jesus is actually quoting Deuteronomy, and he's not the only one who does, because Luke does as well in Acts. Because that passage in Deuteronomy 15, this is a conversation, not just a Q&A, but Luke, the passage in Deuteronomy 15 is where God says, there need be no needy persons among you.
Yes.
If only you will be careful to obey all that I command you. And then a few verses later, the same chapter says, there will always be poor people among you. Therefore, this is what I'm commanding you to do. So the text itself shows this reality. That God says, you don't need to have poverty if you will live the way I'm calling you to live. But given that you won't obey me, there will always be poor people.
Yeah.
So there always being poor people among us is in part a motive, as you said, of our disobedience as a human race, not just as a church.
Yes.
And where Luke quotes that, I think, I don't know if you agree with it, but in Luke 4, where Luke is describing the early Christian church, he says that they had things in common and there were no needy persons among them. And it's almost word for word in Greek of the Greek translation of Deuteronomy 15, which I know you know by heart.
Probably not.
With one change from the singular to the plural, but otherwise it's basically the same. As if Luke is saying that this early community of the followers of Jesus wanted to give their spiritual unity. They were all one, he says. They wanted to give that economic reality. And so they were doing something that would deal with the issue of poverty in their midst. And he quotes from Deuteronomy 15 at that point. Interesting.
Yes, very, very interesting. And this is, when communities begin, they begin so well. And they begin with bright potentials, but then we lose it on the way. And let's not think of the Levites that they actually lived this way, because there's a lot of criticism on the Levites from the prophets. And even when you get into the book of Judges in the land, they are the worst examples. So, yes, this is a challenge for the Levites. They have not lived in this dependence on God either.
All right. Here's another one. We've got still a few minutes.
More questions for Chris?
Yeah. Are there ways in which you might invite churches to reimagine giving, and how they handle, as churches, how they handle their finances in the light of these passages in Deuteronomy? And does Deuteronomy speak to our desire to spend money, for example, on church buildings as well as on the poor? Should one be prioritized or what? So in relation to church finances, where do you think what you're saying cuts?
Wow.
Yes.
Which church asked this?
I know.
Yes, it's really hard to say. I mean, each church has to collectively again, decide and prioritize things. But yeah, it has to do with where is the decision making coming from? Who is included in the decision making? Are all the needs assessed well? And so these are questions to consider before deciding on budgets. But again, Deuteronomy does speak of the triennial tithe, and especially to highlight the sharing of the gifts. But the intention is not to show that money is the answer for everything. And if we don't use money correctly or well, we are doomed. No, the church can exist without money. The church is not dependent on money, and it's not dependent on how we use our budgets. So I don't want to give money more power than it has, because then we get into the notion of, we cannot do this ministry because we have not fundraised, we need to fundraise, or I cannot go into the ministry because I have to raise support, and I cannot raise support, and therefore I cannot go into the ministry. We make money the decisive factor for the kingdom running. No, the church has moved and grew without money and poverty and with whatever each one had, and even in great lack. So I don't think this text intends to say that without our money nothing will happen. It surely. And you know this very well in the Shema, in chapter 6. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, or your soul. And might there includes the capital, the buying power of each person, the belongings of each person. But look at all the other things included. So sometimes we use money in order to keep our soul and our heart safe back here. So I can substitute my whole heart and my presence with just giving some money. So yeah, we must read this thing holistically. And the aspect of love in the book of Deuteronomy is huge. Everything that we do for God, the entire law that we do for God, we must do it with love for Him. And this is repeated constantly in Deuteronomy. And when people live love out, we think, okay, now we can solve by just giving money or by just doing that, or by keeping the law without love and becoming legalistic. So love has to be there in all our actions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. 1 Corinthians 13, as Paul says.
Yes.
And you're right. It's amazing how often the verb love is there in Deuteronomy.
Yes, yes.
And love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your very muchness.
Yes.
It's an incredible word. It just means everything you are, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes.
We may have time for this question, and then we'll see. You mentioned that when tithes were fulfilled, then the land would be blessed. Is there any connection between the neglect of the poor and our current ecological crisis?
Very good. Very good question.
That'll be our last question. It's a very deep one, I think.
Yes.
Do you want me to repeat that? You got it? Is there a connection between neglect of the poor, and I think it's meant in a general global sense, and our current ecological crisis?
Well, you know this better, Chris, because you wrote so much about the land and the connection, the biblical way of viewing covenant is covenant of God and people and land. It's never separated. These things are never separate from the beginning of creation. So anything that happens in the relationship of humans and God, or in the relationship of human beings with each other, the land suffers. From the first killing, the land opens to receive Abel's blood, and it's crying out, the blood is crying out. So the land is hosting the injustices, and it cannot host more, it cannot hold more. So I think it's very connected with this. Certainly in Deuteronomy, every time there's a speech about blessing, it's related to economic help to the poor. So yes, generally the land is affected by injustices. Mystically, I don't know, but sometimes very straightforwardly, when we abuse it, of course it will yield bad results for us. But I believe if you hold to the narrative of Scripture, the entire narrative of Scripture, and the interconnectedness of sin, of our community as human beings, and the results on the land, and viewing land as an active participant in our life, and not separating ourselves. This notion of humans and nature, this separation is an artificial notion. We're not really so separate.
No, that's right. Someone has said it's not that we care for the environment cares for us. You know, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the creation, plus the fact that, as you mentioned, Deuteronomy is there, but in a number of prophets, certainly in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and others, human sin and injustice is shown to have a very detrimental effect on animals and trees and land.
Exactly.
And indeed, Isaiah pictures the trees rejoicing that because the Nebuchadnezzar has been defeated, nobody is coming to cut us down, they say.
Yes.
So the destruction of nature, especially in war, as a result of war, ecocide as we call it in war, is still a reality today. And the Old Testament protests against it and said God is angry, which also makes, of course, to end on a positive note, the vision of the future, such a wonderful thing, because it's in the Old Testament that we read in the Psalms that, you know, the trees are clapping their hands, the fields are rejoicing, the mountains, the streams, everything is rejoicing. Why? Because God is coming to put things right. And in Psalm 96, Psalm 98. And then we see at the very end of the Bible that what we're looking forward to is a new creation, new heavens, new earth, when the earth itself is liberated, as Paul says in Romans 8, from its bondage to decay, when we are liberated from our folly and sin.
Yes.
So the connection is very strong throughout the scriptures.
Yes, exactly. And there's a lot in Deuteronomy about nature, and you mentioned one of them now from 20, about the trees, not to cut the trees.
Don't cut the fruit trees down.
The fruit trees when you're in war, because they are feeding you.
Yes.
And even this sentence, that are they human beings that you're attacking them? Like even connecting the tree, making you think of it as like you. Why are you attacking it? It's not a human being to defend itself. It cannot do anything. It's just there. So it's your responsibility to see it as a defenseless thing. It's incredible. Yeah, I just love that.
Same book, Deuteronomy. The least of the commandments and the law is the law of the bird's nest, isn't it? If you come on a bird's nest, you can take the eggs, but don't steal the mother, because it's going to lay more eggs. And then Jesus says that not even a sparrow falls to earth without your heavenly Father. So he drank deeply from Deuteronomy. We've come to the end, really. We must stop. So let's give another... First of all, may I thank those who've asked the questions, whether from our live stream online or from here. Thank you for asking. So we only got about 10 out of 20 or 30 questions that were sent in, but they were good questions, and thank you, Myrto, for answering them so well. So we can say thank you again to Myrto. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that leaves only just me to say thank you all for coming, and thanks for watching and listening. And also to say that next year we know who's going to be our lecturer for the John Stott London Lecture. It's always nice to be able to announce it in advance. There he is on the screen. Many of us here from All Souls will know John Wyatt. And his title, there it is, Artificial Intelligence, AI, and Authentic Intergenerational Disciple Making in a Digital Age. You got it? There it is on the screen. So that's next year. I believe it's on the 21st of November, so a little bit later this year, but it'll be November again next year, the John Stott London Lecture. So I hope we'll see you there. Thank you again for coming. God bless.